Hi there, and welcome to Practice with me. My name is Koi, and in this video series, I pick a drawing skill to practice for 5 days. I'll walk you through the process I used to practice and how I felt throughout each day. Then at the end, I'll have a recap that covers my overall thoughts on the exercise. I'm starting this series so I practice more consistently, since I currently don't have that much structure to what I'm doing, and I want to improve my skills on a more consistent basis. Skills in the series can and likely will be repeated because there's no point in practicing something only once. This week's skill is figure drawing. The reason I chose this is because for my animation class this semester, our weekly homework is to draw people or animals from life. I typically go to my local park or mall to draw the people there. This video is not my animation homework that I'm turning in, but more like an extension I'm making myself do outside of class for the sake of personal practice and improvement. I do prefer drawing from real life, but I record my videos late at night and I don't fancy going outside when it's dark. Plus, I don't live in an area with particularly abundant nightlife, so digital references are what I will be working from. Let's get started with day 1. So for day 1, I drew from a street cam live stream in Tokyo. There are a lot of improvements I could have made, but hindsight's always 20/20. The two things that I struggled with the most was 1, capturing the gesture of the figure, and 2, quickly figuring out the 3D forms of the body. When I was trying to capture the gesture, my first mistake was trying to draw from a memory of the movement rather than drawing the gesture on the canvas as a way to commit the movement to memory. I definitely should have drawn the stick gesture first to commit the movement to memory, instead of trying to draw a gesture based off of my memory. It sounds kind of samey, but it's two different things, I promise. This is because what happened a lot today was someone would get into a pose that I like, and I was like, that's it, I need to memorize the movement. But before I could memorize the movement, they would leave the movement, and then I'd have to draw my gesture based off of that incomplete memory, and this led to overall stiffer figures that didn't really feel natural. Like, they're not terrible, but you can tell something's off. Now, when working from the YouTube live stream, I found that it was more difficult to get down the 3D forms of the body as well. I think this is because I've recently been drawing more from real life, and drawing from real life feels much easier than drawing from digital reference. This is because in real life, I can see the person in front of me and how they're physically moving through the space, and the 3D forms simply exist in front of me, and I just have to transfer them to the paper. But when working from the YouTube live stream, the space is flat because it's displayed on a screen, and this made me feel a lot less confident about the forms I was drawing, because instead of the 3D person in front of me, it was a 2D image of the person, and I felt like I had to do a lot more guesswork about how the 3D forms of their body were working before I could put them onto the paper. But overall, I like how these turned out. They look pretty similar to my first life drawing homework from my animation class, and I think with practice things will get easier. I did also notice that there were some improvements I could make for when I film tomorrow. The first is to properly warm up, because when I draw in my animation sketchbook for my homework, I always warm up in my everything sketchbook beforehand. It's a separate sketchbook that I keep just for like all my random stuff. And in that sketchbook, I do at least 1 page of cubes or cylinders, and sometimes I'll throw pyramids into the mix to spice up the warm-up. I didn't do this warm-up before working digitally today because I didn't have a ton of time to film, but skipping the warm-up was definitely a mistake. So moving forward, I'm going to warm up digitally just like how I warm up before doing traditional drawing, even if it means a little less recording time. The second thing I noticed in hindsight was this kind of turned into me drawing people with interesting outfits more than drawing people to like learn the human form and the gesture and the nuances of movement. So I kind of lost track of the focus of the exercise. So tomorrow, I think I'm going to find a source with more variety in what people are doing, so that way I can try and keep my focus on the forms of the body rather than the interesting clothes people are wearing. And we can practice clothing another time. On to day 2. Day 2. As stated before, I wanted to focus more on the forms and movement of the human body rather than what the people were wearing. I chose a city walkthrough video that showcased people walking around a city and sitting at cafes and stuff. And this made me really reconsider what I look like when I go outside, because what if someone in the future is filming a city walkthrough video and happens to capture me being a goblin outside? Well, I guess it's not the worst way to be remembered, but like, oof. Anyways, I did implement the changes that I wanted to make from day 1. I did my warm-up digitally, and I also focused more on the figure forms rather than the clothing. I still did draw the clothing, and in some of the figures I did erase the figure underneath, but I wanted to make sure that my lines were clear because my quick sketches aren't the cleanest. I did feel better about capturing the movement and the gesture this time, but the scale of the figures became a new problem, and I realized as I continued throughout the exercise that their feet were often getting cut off at the bottom edge of the page. I mean, it's kind of great for me because I hate feet, but not great for drawing because it means I'm struggling with scaling my figures properly. I tried a couple times to use the lasso tool to move things around, but I think it would be more beneficial if I'm more intentional about the scale of my figures moving forward with this exercise. Overall, I felt pretty good today, so let's look at day 3. Day 3 went okay overall, but there is one issue. I was definitely more mindful about the scale of the figures and found that the scale of the figures will change based upon the action they're doing, and I have to take this difference into account if I want them all to line up nicely in the final figure lineup, but the issue doesn't have to do anything with the scale of the figures. The big issue was that I didn't want to continue drawing figures. I kind of wanted to give up, and it was only day 3, and I was like, something is wrong and I need to figure it out. And so, while the repetitive practice is helpful and I do have a stronger understanding of walking and standing forms than I did at the beginning of the week, I was feeling super unmotivated to draw and record more for some reason. So I had to look at why I wanted to give up. My figures and my level of comfort working on a digital drawing program have both improved, and those are steps in the right direction. And that wasn't what was making me feel iffy, so what was wrong? I definitely need to continue practicing because where my skills are right now are not enough to land me any type of work. So that's something I'm working towards, not the problem. The problem was that I was really bored of drawing standing and walking figures. Now, it may not seem like I draw that many standing or walking figures from this video, but again, this practice is an extension of my animation homework, and since I do my animation homework at the mall, where people only are really standing or walking, I have drawn so many walking and standing figures to the point where I wanted to draw something that wasn't someone standing or walking. So I pivoted to try and find a source to draw from that would have a faster pace and a more dynamic set of poses to practice capturing. This would force me to focus more on the gestures and forms of the human body over distracting things like clothes and hair. And while drawing clothes and hair isn't a bad thing, again, it's not the aim of what I wanted to practice for this video. So my solution? It was to watch YouTube. Let's talk about it some more in day 4. It's day 4, and as tempting as it was to simply watch my favorite YouTubers instead of drawing, I did end up actually searching for a solution to my problem. And the solution was watching sports recordings on YouTube. Sports! Yay! Anyways, I spent some time debating what sport to draw from, but ultimately I chose volleyball. It's a sport I used to play, so I'm familiar with how the figure should look, but not so familiar that I would be bored. I noticed that I was approaching figure drawing in a weird-ish way, because I was thinking through an animation mindset, where I would see the action and then try to pick out the keyframe or most important pose to draw. So with walking and standing figures, it's not too much of a problem to approach things this way because walking and standing figures are either repetitive or stationary, so it's pretty easy to capture the important parts of the movement. But with dynamic figures that move a lot more quickly, like in sports, the key poses are only hit for a brief moment before moving on. So this forced me to be really selective about what poses I tried capturing. If I tried to capture a pose that was sort of like an in-between or a pose where the action wasn't clear, it always turned out less than ideal because my memory wouldn't be able to remember the nuances of the movement compared to the quote-unquote key poses that had much more memorable points of reference. And I know that I mentioned stick gestures in one of the previous days, but guess who didn't decide to actually use them until now? Me. Because my memory is a gift. Anyways, I got into the habit of making and shrinking down the stick gestures to reference while puzzling together the 3D forms of the body. I noticed that after making the stick gestures to the side, it made my more worked out figures less stiff, and the movement felt more natural than when I had been working completely from memory. For day 5, I'm going to continue using the stick gesture method, but I'm going to switch to a sport that I'm not familiar with. This is so, in theory, I'm forced to buckle down and capture the motions with the stick gesture rather than filling in the missing information from personal experience playing the sport. The assistant from my animation class suggested I try watching a boxing video, and that sounds like fun. So let's look at day 5. Now, I did technically spend day 5 rotting under my blankets with my emotional support toilet paper roll because I got sick. I did record the next day instead, but in hindsight, I think I should have spent that time resting or studying the movements in boxing at least a little bit before jumping headfirst into the exercise, but I was impatient and I wanted to get back to drawing. I wasn't too happy with how the day 5 figures came out. This time, the figures felt a lot more flat because I was focusing more on the outlines of the form rather than actually implying the 3D form through the lines in the figure. This made the limbs feel more like 2D shapes rather than 3D forms, so the poses looked weird because the spacing between the limbs and the body were unclear. And because I wasn't familiar with how movement in boxing worked, I found that capturing the gesture was a lot more difficult. And I had difficulty picking poses because the majority of the poses felt like quote-unquote in-betweens because they had a lot of overlap. This is because in boxing, there's a lot of overlapping body parts because the boxers have to guard themselves so they don't get hit, while in volleyball, there's much less overlapping in the poses because the athletes have to take up as much space as humanly possible to guard the floor. And so, because in boxing there were so many overlapping body parts and I wasn't familiar with them, I struggled a ton trying to capture the movements and the gestures, and I felt kind of unhappy by the end of my drawing session. So next time I practice drawing figures, I will be looking for videos that have figures that are doing things that are more to my interests, I guess, because even though sports are cool, they're not something I'm particularly interested in anyways. And I think that also added to my frustrations in the 4th and the 5th days. Perhaps next time I practice figures, I can search up dance practices or something, because that still has a lot of dynamic poses, but aligns more with the things that I find interesting. So that's the end of day 5. It wasn't the best, but I think the overall experience was pretty positive, so let's talk about that. So, after 5 days, am I feeling happy with the work I've produced? I'm leaning towards yes overall, but there are definitely some notes that I want to discuss. First of all, I am happy that I did feel an improvement in capturing the gesture and the human forms between day 1 and day 5, even though I wasn't the happiest with my work from days 4 and 5. This is good because it's an overall, there is some positive progress happening, and I'm happy to see it. Using the stick gesture to capture the motion and using the stick gesture to build the 3D forms off of was really, really helpful because it helped capture the nuances in the movement that otherwise would be lost to my memory. So I think that was a really helpful thing to figure out. I learned that I preferred working from real-life sources rather than the videos of recordings I found online. Again, this is because drawing the 3D form from life onto paper felt really different from inferring the 3D form from a flat video image to then transfer to my drawing software. The second process felt a lot more clunky to me. I do think this can be improved upon with more fundamentals practice, but it was something that did bother me, especially towards the end when the forms and the dynamic poses were really difficult to infer. It wasn't the worst experience though, and since I do record these late at night and there's nothing to draw outside, I am kind of stuck with the digital sources, so I have to learn to live with it. I did feel a little sad that the visual appeal of my drawings went down between day 1 and day 5, because the day 1 drawings had all these polished clothes and the figures and the accessories and the hair, and day 5 is just here is a really wonky human figure. But I think the change is normal considering how I changed the exercise as I continued the practice. Since walking and standing figures were fairly familiar, I'd be able to get the motion down quickly, and I would get distracted by adding the fun things like clothes and hair and accessories. But that wasn't the goal of the exercise, and I'm happy I was able to catch myself being distracted and redirect myself to focus on what I needed to focus on by working with the increasingly dynamic poses and movements. But some level of familiarity does seem to be best for learning, because with the volleyball practice, I was overall pretty happy with the work, and I could see the problem areas more clearly compared to when I practiced from the boxing video. where I wasn't as familiar with the movements, and overall it threw my practice session off because I was feeling bad about it. Lastly, I think it's hard for me to measure the overall improvement I make without a clear benchmark of where I started. Like, I can see the differences between day 1 and day 5 kind of, but I've watched a couple other videos in a similar area to this where some artists have like a base piece they create before their challenge, and then after they make another version of that to implement what they have been practicing. And it shows a much clearer improvement of their knowledge than what I think I've done with this video. And I think that would be a cool practice to start doing, so moving forward I'm gonna have like a base piece that I do before the practice, and then I'm gonna remake it afterwards to see the improvements. So while my skills are nothing to write home about, I'm happy that I've improved a little bit and have some insight on how to better structure my practice and my videos moving forward. If you're still here, thanks for sticking around. Hope to see you next time. Take care of yourself. Thanks for watching.